Punisher begins with the appearance of the leading actor in this film, Frank Castle. He is a former member of the Special Forces nicknamed the Punisher. One night, a shootout broke out between Frank and two members of a motorcycle gang. Frank hit the motorcycle gang members with his car and then crushed them until they were destroyed. The scene shifts to Mexico, where an arrogant cartel boss claims to be the only person who escaped the Punisher's pursuit. This man did not suspect that Frank was targeting him with a sniper, and in the end, he was shot dead from a distance from Frank's hand in America's El Paso area. Frank's next target was a man in the airport toilet. The man was immediately killed to avenge the death of Frank's wife and children. 6 months passed, and now Frank works as a construction worker on a project. No one knows Frank's true identity because he deliberately hides it. Frank is only busy working every day, then takes a break to eat sandwiches, which is a mainstay for his wife and children. Memories of his family always appeared in the shadows of Frank's mind, making him anxious. One day, several workers complained that Frank was too diligent and considered an idiot. Frank always worked from morning to night, making the other construction workers angry because the man took their overtime. They deliberately disturb and warn Frank, making the man restrain himself when Lance threatens, even stepping on Frank's favorite sandwich. A new worker named Donnie gives sandwiches made by his grandmother. Because he saw the bullet wounds on Frank's body, Donnie knew that Frank was an ex-soldier. Donnie's father was the same, having served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Donnie began to tell that his parents had been killed by someone who had just passed their driving test. Even though his identity has been changed, Frank is still in touch with his colleague, Lieutenant Curtis, who leads a community of ex-Marines. But now, Curtis uses a prosthetic leg due to past battles. The scene moves to Homeland Security headquarters, where a female agent named Dana Madani investigates the death of her partner, Ahmad Zubair. Previously, Zubair was kidnapped at his home in Kandahar and then shot dead. Now Madani is assigned to a new partner named Sam Steen, led by their boss, Wolf. The case of Zubair's death was related to drug smuggling carried out by American soldiers in Afghanistan. Still, it turned out that Wolf strictly prohibited Madani's investigation, because, according to him, the topic of Kandahar is not his authority. Even though they didn't get the green light from their superiors, Madani and Sam continued to investigate Zubair's death secretly. They began their investigation by looking for information about a Navy colonel named Schoonover and Lieutenant Frank Castle. All this time, they knew the Punisher was dead. In the report they received, the two people had died in New York on the same day within 20 miles of each other. Lance asked his friend Paulie for help looking for extra work because he needed a lot of money. Donnie is brought into bad company with these novice criminals. Donnie is forced to pay for their drinks. At the project, Frank overhears Lance and Paulie discussing planning to rob the gambling table. The two of them go back to interrupt the sleeping lion and accuse Frank of overhearing. Suddenly, a work accident happened to their co-worker, but Frank didn't want to care. Because one of their friends was injured, Lance invited Donnie to take part in his robbery. In the evening, Lance and his robbers started their action by wearing head coverings. They entered the criminal's lair to rob money at the gambling table. Because he was nervous, Donnie accidentally spilt his money again, and Donnie's identity was even revealed because his wallet fell. That night, they immediately escape after getting money from the criminal station. They don't know the big risks that await in the future. Meanwhile, Frank couldn't sleep because his wife's death always haunted his sleep. So, at 3 a.m., Frank decided to come to the project and release his sadness by beating the wall. At the same time, Lance and his team also went to the project. Lance and his friends beat Donnie because his careless actions could reveal their identities. They intend to bury Donnie alive. Frank, who was there too, couldn't let such a tragedy happen to Frank. The sleeping lion was forced to wake up again. The Punisher returns to action to finish them off. Paulie, who intended to escape, was shot dead in the corpse car. After that, they were put in the same cement pool as Donnie's position. Before being killed, Frank forces Lance to tell him where he robbed his money, because Frank needs that important information. After that, Frank helped Donnie climb out of the cement puddle. Donnie managed to climb back up without knowing the person who had saved him. because Frank immediately left after Donnie managed to survive. Meanwhile, at their quarters, the Mafia group that was robbed had prepared their weapons to storm Donnie's house, but suddenly, the lights went out, followed by a series of gunshots. When the lights came back on, all the Mafia members had been dead, leaving only the boss. It turns out that the person who came to clean their base was Frank. In the end, Frank also killed the boss, so that they wouldn't cause problems with Donnie's family. Somewhere, a man named David sees CCTV footage of Frank leaving the location of the massacre of Mafia members. After that, the film continues to episode 2. On the very ship, Frank remembered his time together with his 2 children, but now they were dead, which made Frank's heart sad. When he arrived at a restaurant, the waiter told Frank someone had called him. It made him a little surprised that someone recognized his identity. Apparently, it was David who called. He told Frank he had sent him a videotape. It's not clear what David's goal is, but he refuses to meet Frank directly. As Frank was leaving the restaurant, a garbage truck passed away. Frank immediately ran towards the roof of the building opposite the restaurant. In that place, he only found a rearview mirror and a flashlight. David is actually on the roof of the restaurant. After failing to catch David, Frank looks back at the video that David sent him at home. The video contains footage of an armed military group wearing head coverings and shooting their victims dead. The question is, does Frank have anything to do with the video? Frank immediately went to Curtis to confirm whether he had revealed Frank's identity, because there is someone who knows his identity. Curtis made sure he never let anyone slip about Frank. It turned out that Frank was the one who killed Schoonover in connection with the death of his wife and children. Not only Frank, but it turns out that Madani also saw the video recording. But the video was stolen while he was in Kandahar. Madani couldn't confirm whether Schoonover and Frank were in the video because they were all wearing masks. But Madani holds one of Frank's unit members named Billy. In another place, a woman named Karen gives alms to a beggar, but the girl is immediately shocked when she hears that the beggar knows her name. It turns out the beggar was Frank, so Karen takes Frank to her apartment. At this time, Frank wants to know if Karen leaked his identity. This beautiful woman strictly answered no. Then Frank asked Karen for help investigating someone named David. Before leaving, Frank said that if Karen had any information about David, she was asked to put flowers in front of her window. After that, Karen hugged Frank tightly, as if a feeling of longing had been hidden between them for a long time. After getting information about David, a long story short, Frank accidentally crashed himself in front of Sarah's house, David's wife. It turned out that David knew Frank's behavior from the monitor screen. David was shocked and afraid that Frank would hurt his family. Sarah invited Frank into the house to treat his wound without any suspicion. Sarah said that her husband, who had worked in the government, had died in a tragic accident. At this time, David was already in front of his house, but he couldn't bring himself to act. After returning to his house, Frank had his hair shaved neatly. Another time, Wolf, who had just arrived at his home, was attacked by a masked man, and the two of them got into a fierce fight. In the end, Wolf is caught and tied to a chair. Then he was forced to talk about David Lieberman, a man killed by Wolf. Every time he didn't believe the answer, the perpetrator would shoot Wolf in the leg. Finally, Wolf managed to untie the knot and seize the perpetrator's gun. When the mask on the perpetrator's head was removed, it turned out he was Frank. Wolf is shocked because all this time, he thought Frank was dead. Here, Wolf admits to having killed Frank's family to distract him. Wolf believed that Frank had sent the videotape, and now he would finish Frank off. However, it turned out that the gun had no bullets, so Frank immediately finished off Wolf without mercy. At another place, Madani is relaxing at the bar with Billy. Madani has read Billy's file, a former Special Forces officer. Usually, Billy is a scout or a sniper. Behind his sweet face, Billy has killed 1304 people. Billy firmly answered that Frank was his best friend when asked about Frank. Tired of Madani's questions, Billy seduced her because they were both single. A few moments later, when they came to the boss's house, Wolf, Madani was shocked when she saw the man's body. David contacted Frank again. He wants to know why Frank came to his house, But now the threat is gone because Frank has killed Wolf. So now Frank decides how they meet. David was told to come to a bridge and wait for 20 minutes. After that, move again to the port. David had to wait another 20 minutes until finally arriving at a tomb. Curtis, assigned to monitor David, ensured no one followed him. After following Frank's orders, David is surprised that Frank didn't come. Only Curtis appears. Finally, the hacker returned home to his hiding place, even though Frank was secretly hiding in the trunk of his car. David was very surprised because Frank suddenly appeared in front of him. Frank immediately hit Curtis because the man dared to play with him. After that, the film continues to episode 3. Frank immediately tied David to a chair while he was naked. Suddenly, the alarm sounded. David said that the place had been installed with an automatic explosive device. They only have 3 minutes to deactivate it via the David Eye Retina sensor. Frank feels cheated because David is hiding a gun. At this time, David began to honestly admit that he was an NSA analyst working for Afghan intelligence. One day, he received the recording. At that time, David was confused about whether to hand over the recording to his superiors or give it to the authorities he trusted. David has uploaded the video but hasn't sent it to Madani. When he was traveling with his wife and children, when he saw several officers hunting him, David immediately ran away. It was at that moment that Wolf surrounded David. He said he is not a criminal, but an NSA analyst. Wolf even said he had a gun, then shot David until he fell into the lake. At that time, David did not die because it turned out the bullet hit his cell phone. After that incident, David decided to hide. Even David's family didn't know if he was still alive. It turns out that Billy has regularly donated to the Veterans Foundation, which Curtis manages. Feeling comfortable with his current profession, Curtis refuses to invite Billy to join him as an instructor at his environmental security company. The film also flashbacks to when Frank was still active in the Special Forces unit. At that time, a CAI agent named Rollin explained a Cerberus operation with direction from Major S. Connor. These troops are given orders to capture, interrogate, and execute high-value targets. Frank asked whether this operation had received approval from Congress. Rollin said Congress had approved it, and they just had to act. Frank and Billy were appointed as squad leaders. Returning to David's headquarters, the man said there were no explosives. Instead, he had hidden the camera that recorded Frank's face. Then David threatened to send the video recording to the media. Frank was angry with David because the videotape he sent was his family being the victim. At that time, Ahmad Zubair was being held hostage. As far as the troops knew, Zubair was a separatist member, even though Zubair was a good police officer. But Rollin still issued the order to kill him. Frank still remembers that before being buried, Frank took out the bullet that was lodged in Zubair's body as instructed by Schoonover. That night, Billy and Curtis came to Frank's grave, and Billy knew that his best friend had died. Frank refuses to let David return to David's base, still not trusting David. Suddenly, David thrust a pen containing an anesthetic at Frank, causing the tough man to fall unconscious for a short time. In another place, a veteran named Lewis almost shot his father because he was haunted by what happened while he was on the battlefield. The disease is called PTSD. Meanwhile, Sam provides a banknote report at the office on Wolf's account, which reaches $30 million. It was an unusual amount that they had to investigate the source of. Frank finally regained consciousness, although his body was still reeling. David tried to prove he had no bad intentions, so that's why he didn't kill Frank. David invites Frank to collaborate in hunting down the perpetrators who want to do evil to them. Frank began to tell the story. At that time, the Special Forces team received a secret raid mission without air support, but Frank felt that this was a trap that the Taliban had prepared. Rollins and his commanders did not respond well to Frank's concerns. Long story short, the team was already at the battle location, and Frank's guess was correct. The team was pressed and helpless. Several of his colleagues have become victims. Enraged, Frank slaughtered the enemy alone. Frank's fighting was like a lion going berserk when his limbs were injured. When he returned to base, Frank immediately wreaked his emotions towards Rollins, who cared more about his target. At that moment, Billy decided to resign from the unit and return to the force. David showed evidence that the Cerberus operation carried out by Frank's team was not officially recorded and had not even received congressional approval. At this point, Frank realized that his troops were only being used as tools. Finally, Frank accepted David's offer to collaborate. Feeling like he was on a battlefield, Lewis dug into the ground behind his house for shelter. In a different time and place, a weapons supplier to a Greek gang is captured by Frank. One of the special order guns called a Sweet 16 caught Frank's attention, so Frank grabbed the gun and ran away again. Madani was met by her boss and the person who recruited him 15 years ago, named Rafi. The man said that the Inspector General would take over Wolf's death case after Wolf's corruption case was discovered. Curtis met with Lewis to provide motivation and advised him to go back to sleep in his room. Lewin rejected Curtis' suggestion. He instead determined to join Anvil to become an instructor. At the Anvil office, Billy provides briefings for all new employees registering with his company, including Lewis. The Homeland team discussed plans to ambush the weapons mafia under Madani's leadership directly by placing several members, including snipers, at the transaction location. Lewis looks very enthusiastic about his new profession at the Anvil Company. David received information about the ambush plan that Homeland would carry out by hacking their computer network defenses. This is where Frank plans to seize his weapons for this mission. To carry out this mission, they need a sports car. Frank catches a group of robbers who want to steal a sports car from a repair shop. After showing his grenade, Frank managed to get rid of them all. It turned out that the grenade was fake. The robbers were tricked. They managed to take one of the sports cars for the armed robbery mission. Curtis tells Billy that Lewis has PTSD and almost shot his father. Even Lewis lives in a hole. Curtis only worries that Lewis could endanger other employees in Billy's company one day. At that time, Billy stopped Lewis, but this former soldier did not accept it because he knew that the mastermind was Curtis. That night, Madani's team was carrying out its operation. Hearing Madani's team's conversation, David deliberately intercepted their conversation so that they could take action to seize the gun truck from the hands of the Mafia. Frank forces 2 Mafia members to fall, or they will be burned. The gun truck was successfully confiscated without the authorities knowing. Madani, who realized that fake recordings had tricked her, immediately gave chase. Frank intercepted Madani, and a chase ensued. The 2 cars faced each other in a battle of courage, but suddenly David hit Madani's car. Even so, Frank still saved the injured Madani. In a semi-conscious state, Madani saw Frank taking him and told him not to interfere in his affairs. And after that, the film continues to episode 5. Madani escaped death, and she recovered after Frank got her out of the car that David hit. His condition improved again, and she was fresh. Meanwhile, Frank and David blame each other for their ridiculous actions on the night of the incident that almost killed Madani. Frank returned to visit Sarah and David's children, as if to replace David's role in being with them. This was enough to make David hurt. Even though her condition had not yet recovered 100%, Madani insisted on returning to duty. She chose to keep her important findings a secret from Rafi if Frank was still alive. Back at David's base, Frank says the person who recorded the video of Zubair being held hostage was Gunnar. He only met Gunnar after being recruited from an elite team to join the Cerberus operation. Their big question is who the identity of the Orange Agent was and who was the mastermind behind Zubair's arrest and murder. The next scene shows William Rawlins, now a CIA agent. Rawlins was seen filling out material for his subordinates. The scar on Rawlins' temple is evidence of a terrible blow from Frank in the past, after Frank's colleagues were killed in a ridiculous operation planned by Rawlins. Madani called Karen to her office because she wanted to know more about Frank's figure in the eyes of journalists close to him. It turns out that previously Karen was Frank's defense team. She was once kidnapped from witness protection, but in fact, Karen is still alive and well. Karen says Frank is a good and honest person with principles and honor, even though Frank reportedly killed a lot of people. After that, Madani assigned Sam to find out about everything related to Frank, Edward Drogen, and Gunnar Henderson. Because Sam didn't want to be taken advantage of by Madani, Madani finally told Sam that Frank was still alive and saved him. But Madani asked Sam to keep it a secret first. It turns out that Rollin heard Madani's conversation telling Sam to investigate Frank and his colleagues, which is related to Zubair's death. Frank returned to meet Karen and Madani in the evening to find out about him. Karen cried and poured out her heart, hoping Frank would end all this. But Frank can't because he wants to endanger Karen when he completes his revenge mission. On the other hand, Rollin received a medal as the best intel from the CIA director. The CIA representative, Marion, doesn't know how evil Rollin is. Because of this, they gave an award to Rollin. Frank and David meet Gunnar at his hideout to get information about the real Rollins. In his office, Rollin also received an offer to serve as deputy director of the CIA. Of course, Rollin would not let go of that opportunity. Arriving in the forest, Frank continued his journey on foot while David waited in the car. As a former Special Forces member, Frank could detect traps set in corners of the forest. After finding a cabin, Frank leaves his bag and knife so Gunnar won't feel threatened by his arrival. Suddenly, Gunnar released an arrow which hit Frank's shoulder. Frank tries to explain that he came only to get information because his family had been killed, and he had killed Major Schoonover, who had betrayed them. Gunnar admitted that he did not know the identity of the CIA agent. Still, he was sure that Colonel Bannett was involved. Suddenly, they had uninvited guests, a group of military-grade armed men equipped with surveillance cameras. They came on Rollins' orders to finish off Gunnar. Finally, they worked together to face this enemy. Fighting broke out. When Frank stabbed one of the military members, Rollin could see from the camera that Frank was still alive. Meanwhile, David flies his drone to help Frank. As a result of this battle, Gunnar was hit by enemy fire. While hiding behind a fallen tree, David gave Frank a code that 2 enemies would ambush. The enemy was cleared, but the threat was not completely gone. Finally, the remaining 4 enemies were successfully finished off. Finally, night came, and Frank no longer had the strength to carry Gunnar, who was most seriously injured. He was forced to leave Gunnar in the forest. Meanwhile, Frank was lying weak in the forest. Meanwhile, Madani and Billy's relationship continues in bed. David immediately brought Frank after finding him unconscious with quite serious injuries. Arriving at headquarters, David asked Curtis to help heal Frank. After checking his blood pressure, which was getting low, Curtis had to immediately remove the arrow that was still lodged in Frank's shoulder. That morning, Billy saw Madani's work file about his best friend, Frank. Billy felt that he had been taken advantage of by Madani. He hoped that Madani would explain everything because he knew that Frank's body had never been found. After realizing this, Frank immediately thought of Gunnar. David said Gunnar was dead, and he had taken care of it. Gunnar had been given a proper burial. One veteran named Connor admitted to Curtis and community members that he received a silver medal for his great combat actions in Vietnam. Meanwhile, Sam managed to get information that Gunnar was found dead in the Kentucky forest. David hears a radio transmission call from someone calling for Frank. The voice came from Frank's friend, Billy, even though Billy shouldn't have known that Frank was still alive. Connor and Lewis distribute leaflets in front of the Parliament building to deny war veterans their rights, but the police chase them away. Lewis didn't accept it until he was finally arrested. Arriving in the forest, Madani received instructions about what kind of heavy fighting had occurred at that location. This is where Madani learned that another figure was helping Frank fight the armed group. DNA tests were carried out from bloodstains they found at the location. Meanwhile, Frank tells David that he believes in Billy, because Frank felt he already knew Billy's character and traits when they'd both served in Afghanistan. Frank even considered Billy his friend and family. Sam finally believed Madani's words that Frank was still alive because the blood found at the scene of the fight matched Frank's DNA. The big question is, who are they fighting? Is it the military or the CIA? Lewis was again freed by Curtis, even though it should have been Connor who did it. Then Curtis told Lewis that Connor lied about receiving the silver medal because, in his work history, Connor had never been to Vietnam. Madani tells Billy that Frank is still alive. At first, Billy didn't believe it. A year after his friend had died, Madani said this because he didn't want to lose Billy and needed his help to find Frank. Not wanting to waste time, Billy confirmed it directly to Curtis. The man pretended to be surprised because he thought Frank was dead. Billy emphasized that whatever problems Frank faced, he just wanted to help Frank. Curtis immediately conveyed Billy's good intentions to Frank. Even though David has a different opinion, he will keep his secret. Lewis came to Connor's house because he felt he had been lied to. A fight broke out between them until Connor died. Frank decides to go to Billy because he trusts him. Billy was shocked but happy because Frank was still alive and standing before him. Billy admitted that he knew from Madani about Frank's whereabouts. Now Frank reveals the facts about the CIA agent, Agent Orange, namely Lieutenant Bennett. They smuggled drugs from Afghanistan by dissecting the bodies of soldiers to send to America. Billy hopes that Frank will hand over the case to Homeland Security because he will help Frank get a new identity with all his needs abroad. Because of that, Billy hoped Frank would return to meet him at the dock. David saw Frank returning to visit Sarah with jealousy. Unexpectedly, it turns out that Billy is the criminal who collaborates with Rollin. When he returned home with blood on his hands and a gun in his waistband, Lewis was surprised that his father was waiting. It turned out that his father had come to give him sedatives because he understood that Lewis was experiencing quite severe PTSD. Lewis had planned to commit suicide but decided against it. Frank's next target is to obtain the identity of the CIA agent through Colonel Bennett. Sam showed disparagement when Billy entered Madani's room. In reality, Madani was being used by Billy, but she didn't realize it yet. After Billy leaves, Sam openly shows his disappointment with Madani, who trusts civilians more. David has succeeded in hacking into Bennett's computer and his activities. He laughs because Frank will find Bennett tied up by a woman. Madani begins to realize that her office has been bugged. The proof is that Gunner was killed one day after they planned to find him. Rollin and Billy discuss Bennett potentially jeopardizing their plans if Madani or Frank pressure him. Then we see a man in a uniform known as Colonel Bennett, who is easily controlled by a bitch. The colonel could change like a pet dog at night just because of a woman. Frank is infiltrating the colonel's official residence in the military complex. Frank caught the colonel playing with his hired woman. At the same time, Billy and his hunting team also took action. Bennett is surprised that Frank is still alive. Frank didn't kill the colonel because it turned out Frank's main goal was to hack the colonel's cell phone. David tells Frank to be careful because 4 people are approaching his location. Frank throws a smoke grenade to knock them out. After the hacking process was complete, Frank left the place. Frank doesn't realize one of the perpetrators is Billy. Frank escapes through a tunnel with David's guidance. A young soldier blocked Frank's path, forcing him to open fire. But Frank didn't kill the soldier. David continued to watch Bennett's movements from his cell phone signal. Meanwhile, at his house, Lewis was seen assembling an explosive device using a pressure cooker available in his home. It is not yet clear what Lewis' purpose was in making such an explosive. Colonel Bennett comes to Rollins' house to collect his promise to secure Bennett abroad under a new identity to escape Frank's pursuit. Bennett's cell phone was handed over to Billy because Billy would take care of everything from now on. Finally, Madani and Sam found a listening device hidden under the table, but they deliberately did not remove the tool so the perpetrator would not notice. Frank and David arrive at the CIA's safe house according to Bennett's cell phone signal. Frank immediately took out his trusty sniper weapon before starting to act. Bennett was shocked after seeing the woman's body lying covered in blood. At this moment, Billy stabbed the colonel's body until he fell and died immediately. Frank sees Rollin, the target he must kill from his surveillance position to avenge himself. A hot bullet was fired at Rollin's head, but it turned out that the window glass was bulletproof. Frank immediately left there, and after that, the film continued to episode 8. The scene opens with Billy's bad attitude when treating his mother, even though the woman was very sick. Billy gave him a drug injection due to his heartache. From the beginning, Billy felt that his mother never wanted him. Returning to base, David finds information that Rollin is the CIA's director of covert operations. David was worried that Rollin would discover the location of his base, because the ones they were fighting were not ordinary field agents. Because the camera in his house was broken, David asked Frank to see how Sarah and his children were doing. At this point, Sarah felt that Frank cared deeply for her and her children. Sarah needs a replacement figure for her husband, who she thinks is dead. Moreover, Frank always came bringing flowers for her. In her heart, Sarah began to have feelings of love for Frank. Madani and Sam pretend to discuss developments regarding Frank's bullet supplier, Jack. They said they would hold a meeting at a location. They deliberately did this to trap the party who had installed the bug in Madani's office. After the surveillance camera came back on, David saw Sarah confiding in Frank, and they hugged. Even though he was hurt, David couldn't blame Frank because he didn't want to endanger his family. If David appears again, show his face. When he heard the recording of Madani's planned ambush, Old Man Rawling assigned Billy to kill Frank at the meeting location. In a drunken state, David said he would tell Madani all the evidence of Rawlin's crimes. If the CAI director is caught, David believes his life will return to normal and he can return to his family. But Frank disagrees because he thinks a criminal like Rawlin cannot be allowed to live. Elsewhere, Billy summoned 4 former special forces fired because of cases in Iraq. They will be paid $500,000 each to kill Frank. Billy will directly lead this operation to ensure his plan is successful. After preparing weapons and face coverings, Billy and his men moved to the meeting location. Madani and her troops were ready to force them to surrender, but they resisted until a fierce fight could not be avoided. Madani is completely unaware that the enemy she is fighting is her lover. Casualties fell from both sides. Madani assigned Sam to ambush the enemy from behind. 4 of Billy's men were successfully killed. Madani is also chasing the last target, and Sam has also ambushed the last perpetrator after killing his member. When the head covering was removed, Sam was surprised to see that the person was Billy. At that moment, Billy immediately stabbed Sam. When Madani arrived at the location, Madani failed to save Sam's life. David wanted to show his face in front of his children, but Frank forbade him because it could have bad consequences for their safety. This episode closes with an intimate scene when Billy cleans the blood on Madani's body very carefully, even though Billy was the perpetrator who made the blood color Madani's body. This 9th episode opens with Madani, who is very sad because she has lost her colleague for the 2nd time. Madani couldn't get out of bed because the grief was too great. Not far from Madani's house, Frank and David were watching him. They want to ensure that Madani can be trusted to expose Director Rawlin's crimes. Suddenly, there was a big explosion not far from their location. The explosions occurred in several places, from government offices regulating weapons circulation to the federal court building in Fullis Square. It turns out that the perpetrator was Lewis, who we previously saw had designed an explosive device with a pot bomb. Previously, Lewis had sent a confession letter, which was shown to the journalist's office because of his disappointment with the government, which prohibited the use of weapons by civilians. The letter was received and read by Karen, but Lewis kept his identity a secret. Karen plans to publish the letter in the newspaper so everyone knows who sent the letter. Frank considers the perpetrator a coward who chose the wrong target. After reading Karen's article in the newspaper, Frank was worried that he would be the target of an attack because he called the perpetrator an immoral criminal. That night, a radio host called on a senator, Stan Ori, who supported gun control legislation. The second guest is Karen, who received a letter from the perpetrator of the explosion. There was a debate between the two parties because Senator Stan mentioned the Punisher, Aka. Frank, who carried out various attacks in the past and was once tried for killing 37 people, but in fact, the 37 people were criminals who were unable to be caught by the police. Lewis suddenly contacted the radio office because the aim of his attack was to be heard by all New Yorkers. Karen firmly disagrees with Lewis' actions because he killed and injured innocent civilians for whatever reason. Feeling cornered, Lewis threatened Senator Stan and Karen with the phrase "Sic semper tyrannis," which means die with tyranny. After hearing the person's voice, Frank remembered that the perpetrator was Lewis, a community member led by Curtis. At that time, David was assigned to track her down because Frank was worried that Karen would be the target of Lewis' crimes. Curtis also heard the broadcast, so he went straight to Connor's. Because he smelled a very strong smell of carrion coming from inside the house, Curtis immediately broke down the door, entered the house, and found Connor's body wrapped in plastic. It turns out Lewis was in the house with Connor's body. Because he refused to surrender, Lewis fought back until the two of them got into a fight. But because Curtis' legs were not normal, he lost and was badly beaten by Lewis. The FBI requests information from Karen. At the same time, Frank contacted him and warned him to be careful because he knew the perpetrator. Frank believes Karen will be Lewis' target. David asked Frank to go to a location while tracing a call from Lewis to Curtis' number. Senator Stand enlists Billy's help, recommended by the CIA, to protect him, because the bomber targeted him. In public, the senator seeks popularity by refusing to use firearms. Still, he gives the green light to kill perpetrators who threaten him. Two of Billy's men were assigned to guard the senator. When he arrived at the location, Frank found Curtis sitting on a chair with serious injuries and an explosive device attached to his body. Frank asked Curtis to calm down, and the cell phone in Curtis' pocket suddenly rang. It turns out Lewis was on the roof with his gun. Lewis hoped the police would come so he could shoot them all. Frank tries to change Lewis' wrong way of thinking before he dies. Frank told me what happened to Curtis, and he lost his leg. At that time, there was a big explosion in a market, and everyone was scared, but Curtis tried to save a little girl. Right at that moment, a pregnant woman with suspicious movements was unable to be knocked out by Frank because he remembered his wife. Suddenly, the woman blew herself up, which resulted in Curtis losing his leg. Not wanting to kill his fellow Marines, Lewis finally tells Frank the white wires he must cut. After cutting the cable, Frank immediately ran away because the police, contacted by Lewis, started arriving at the location. The police continued to chase Frank until they were forced to overpower them to seize his car. Meanwhile, David meets Madani to inform those involved in Zubair's death in Kandahar, and the leader is William Rollin, the CIA director who led the operation. To prove Rollin's crimes, Madani must work with Frank. Karen was shocked after Frank's face became public when he was fighting police officers. Karen and David were also very surprised to see the news. The news went viral in New York, filling all the media there. After that, the film continues to episode 10. One of Anvil's employees was killed by Lewis at his home. Mahoney Detection from NWPD asked Billy for information because Lewis had worked for him, and one of his men had been shot dead. Regarding his relationship with Frank, Billy admitted that he last met Frank several years ago. Suddenly, Frank contacted him to withdraw his men from near the senator's stand because Frank was going to hunt Lewis. From here on, the film's plot goes back and forth. The senator is talking to Mahoney after surviving an attack. Karen came to meet the senator to interview him at a hotel. Still, suddenly, there was a big explosion followed by the shooting of two of the senator's bodyguards. Is Frank involved here? Karen gave her testimony by saying that if Frank appeared, it would be to save him and the senator from Lewis' assassination attempt. In contrast to Senator Stand, who said Frank was involved, Karen calls Senator Stand a cruel political creature who will say anything to boost his popularity. At that time, Karen admitted to Billy that she had deliberately brought a weapon for her safety. The gun must be handed over to Billy first, and will be returned after the interview is finished. Disguised as an Anvil security team member, Lewis entered the hotel lobby, and Madani happened to be there too. Lewis entered via the emergency stairs, then shot two security members belonging to Anvil, who were guarding the steps and the front of the door. After that, he planted an explosive on the bedroom door. Just as Karen was interviewing the senator, suddenly, an explosion occurred. Frank acts as a shield when Lewis is about to shoot the senator dead. Because his plan failed, Lewis took Karen as a hostage. Instead of working together, 3 Anvil members attacked Frank. Meanwhile, from Madani's point of view, he returned to her office that morning. She told Rafi that her office was bugged by someone who was believed to have power, and Madani had witnesses who could prove that William Rollin had killed Ahmad Zubair. Madani was shocked when Rafi offered the identities of the suspects who tried to kill him, who turned out to be mercenaries from Billy's Anvil company. Because of this problem, Madani wanted to meet Billy at the hotel. Even though Madani had shown files containing data on all its members, Billy still refused to admit that he was involved in the case. Before their conversation is finished, choose to leave in a hurry because you hear the danger alarm going off. When he went down the stairs to chase Lewis, Frank was blocked by Madani. The woman just wanted to work together to bring Rollin down in court. Because the situation was urgent, Frank didn't care that Madani would shoot him. Suddenly, Billy shot Frank. This, of course, made Frank very surprised, because he had just been hit by someone he considered his friend and brother. Because Billy refused to drop the weapon, Madani became increasingly convinced that Billy was the person who killed Sam. Suddenly, the police appeared to arrest them. While Frank put up a fight, Detective Mahoney got a statement from Madani, exactly like Karen's testimony, that Frank was not as evil as people had known so far. Madani asks Karen for help so she can contact Frank. They were both saved by Frank. After escaping capture, Frank chases Lewis, who takes Karen into the kitchen. The former Marine refused to surrender even though Frank tried to persuade him due to secretly Karen pulling the white cable to deactivate the explosives installed on Lewis' body with a code from Frank. After Karen managed to escape, Lewis chose to enter the cold room to blow himself up. Frank and Karen managed to survive. To escape from that place, Frank was forced to use Karen as a hostage. After they were in the elevator, Frank climbed up the live hallway until he managed to escape. After that, the film continued to episode 11. Frank felt immense pain beyond the bullet that penetrated his skin because of the betrayal of his best friend, Billy. Madani is angry in her office because her lover distorted the facts and blamed Frank for Lewis' attack on the senator. All of this was to cover up the murder he committed against Sam. Sarah and her children were shocked because the Pite they knew was a fugitive named Frank. Madani called Billy to her office to ask for information regarding the death of her partner, Sam. Billy continues to avoid being involved in the incident, but Billy was also surprised when Madani learned about William Rollin's rottenness. Madani pretends to be hunting Frank, who is also chasing Billy. Rollin tells the CIA director, Marion, that Frank has endangered the agency and their position because of the important information he has. Marion was surprised because she never felt she had given Rollin the green light to conduct an illegal operation. Rollin seeks Marion's approval to gain access to the CIA's electronic surveillance devices in New York to capture Frank. That means Marion agreed to Frank's murder. Madani expressed her belief to Rafi that Billy had killed Sam. The police came to ask for information from Sarah because they found a call from her cell phone to Frank. Feeling suspicious about the police coming to her house, Leo, Sarah's daughter, hid. It turns out they were fake police who wanted to kidnap Sarah and her children. David and Frank only realized this incident after they saw the footage of the kidnapping an hour ago. Realizing that his daughter had not been arrested, Frank contacted David's daughter, Leo. Frank directs Leo to throw away his cell phone SIM card, then hides in the park. Frank asks David to come to take Leo to safety and calls Madani. Meanwhile, Frank will wait for the cowards to come to their base, then kill them all and find out where Sarah is hidden. Sarah and her son were held captive at a location on Rollin's orders to Bill. Their goal is to lure Frank out of his hiding place. Rafi invites Marion to meet with Madani, who has evidence of crimes committed by his agent Rollin in carrying out an illegal murder program funded by drugs in Kandahar. Marion does not want to accept these accusations because they do not have strong evidence. Even so, Rafi was determined to continue helping Madani, continuing to shake Marion until he saw what would fall. While waiting for his enemies to arrive, Frank began preparing weapons placed in various corners of their base. David is finally reunited with his daughter and promises to explain everything. Groups of mercenaries began to arrive, but they didn't know what they were facing was the Punisher, the executioner of criminals. Finally, the battle began. It turns out that cowardly Billy didn't jump in, even though Frank hoped that the traitor would face him directly. It didn't take long for the mercenaries to be crushed mercilessly by Frank. They admitted that they did not know where Billy, Sarah, or their children were being held. Frank uses his cell phone to call Billy. He was forcing Frank to carry out an exchange between David and his wife and child. Marion expressed anger at Rollin because now Homeland Security knew about Rollin's illegal operation. It was at this time that Rollin said that he planned to kill Frank and scapegoat Billy to protect the agency's good name. Not satisfied enough to hear Rollin's words, after this was finished, Marion wanted Rollin to resign from the agency. David and his daughter finally met Madani and Frank. After that, the film continues to episode 12. Madani recorded Frank's confession while carrying out a Cerberus operation in Afghanistan, capture, interrogate, and kill high-value targets. This secret murder team was funded by drug smuggling from Kandahar. Colonel Schoonover and Colonel Bennett were a member of their leadership, namely William Rollin and Marine Billy Russo. Then, it was David's turn to be asked to testify to prove Rollin's crime in killing Ahmad Zubair. David will not provide the video. His children and wife will be guaranteed safety. It was at this moment that Madani was shocked because Frank admitted that he was the one who pulled the trigger to kill Zubair on Rollin's orders. Long story short, Frank and David were already at the meeting location. Not long after, Billy ordered his men to free Sarah and her son in exchange for David. It turned out that Billy was already on top of the building with an M82, a 1 series sniper rifle. At this time, Sarah was surprised that her husband was still alive. Suddenly, Madani and her troops came to the location to carry out an ambush. Still, Billy's men first captured Frank, while David tried to stop the fire heading towards his children and wife. The officers shot Billy's men, but it turned out to hit David's body too, even though Billy wanted to shoot him. Frank is held captive at David's base by Billy. Frank is forced to stop a computer timed to spread all of Billy and Rollin's crimes within a predetermined time. Before that, Frank wanted to know whether Billy was involved in the death of his wife and children. Even though Billy admitted that he wasn't the one who killed Frank's wife, he admitted to being there. Elsewhere, David wakes up fine again. This had all been carefully planned by Madani. David deliberately pretended to be dead after being shot by officers to deceive Billy and all his members. Sarah was surprised because it turned out that David was still alive. Because Frank refused to tell him the password, Rollin appeared and immediately beat Frank severely. Even so, Frank didn't give up. Frank deliberately removed his tracking device because this was part of his plan to deal directly with the two criminals. Frank finally surrenders to Billy. Finally, he handed over the password and eye sensor in front of the computer. Even though Frank did this to attack Rollin, Frank used the same trap that David had used on him at the base. Frank doesn't care even though he is Rollin's target again because the cameras at the base are active. Unable to let his friend be threatened, David shows Madani Frank's location. It turns out that Frank chose to get evidence of their crime, even though it cost him his life. Madani and his team act quickly before Frank is killed. Suddenly, Billy cuts the bonds on Frank's hands before Rollin kills him. So Frank rises again to kill Rollin like a bloodthirsty psychopath. Finally, Madani and her team members surrounded the location. Billy, who was shocked, immediately ran away without caring that he failed to kill Frank. After that, the film continues to episode 13. Frank, who was seriously injured, was taken to Madani's parents' house to receive medical treatment from her father, who is a doctor, likewise with Billy, who took a bullet out of his right arm. Because his crime had been discovered, Billy took his entire money supply to escape. The mercenaries assigned by the CIA to hunt down Billy were killed one by one. After that, Billy blew up his own office. Frank's condition improved the next day, even though his face was badly damaged. Madani decides to release Frank. Madani then presented evidence of the confession of the crime that Billy and Rollin had committed against Rafi and Marion. Madani did not deny that she had released Frank because he thought Frank had sacrificed himself to obtain important evidence. Billy came to Curtis, who was still fast asleep. Billy should have confessed all his mistakes to Frank because Frank hid his death from Billy precisely to protect him. Curtis reminds Billy that Frank would never betray his brother. Billy forces Curtis to show him where Frank is hiding. When Curtis was about to make a cup of coffee for Billy, suddenly someone shot at Billy. But the young man managed to save himself, and then Billy shot Curtis right in the shoulder. Frank contacts Curtis to put him in touch with Billy. Frank challenges Billy to a one-on-one duel without involving Curtis. Billy accepts Frank's challenge to a duel, so the two of them will fight at the amusement park, which becomes a beautiful memory for Frank, his wife, children, and Billy. Their relationship was so close that Frank considered Billy his own brother. That night, when he arrived at the playground, Billy immediately took two playground officers hostage. Frank secretly crawled to the location to ambush Billy. Meanwhile, Madani gets a clue to the location where Frank is thought to be now to solve his problem with Billy. Frank sees two workers tied up on a spinning pony ride, but he hasn't seen Billy. After Frank contacts Billy, he fires several Eclipse launchers, followed by several gunshots. A fierce duel between the two former Special Forces members immediately began. Frank was shot in the leg, but he didn't give up easily. The duel continues on the merry-go-round. It was Frank's turn to shoot Billy in the face. Choose the Cunning One threatens to kill two Wahana workers if Frank doesn't put down his gun. Madani also appeared and intended to stop Billy, but Madani also became the target of the shooting. Frank used this opportunity to attack Billy with his bare hands, so the battle between the two of them became even fiercer. Angry Frank beats Billy badly. Frank smashes Billy's face, even though he could have killed Billy. He deliberately kept Billy alive, so that every time the man looked in the mirror, he would always remember Frank. Finally, Frank fell to his knees while holding Madani, who had a gunshot wound to his head. 3 days passed. Frank saw that Madani was gradually recovering. At that time, Madani was being visited by Rafi and the then CIA director Marion. For his services and Madani's special request, Frank was released on record of covering up the CIA's crimes. Then Frank was given a new identity with the name Pite. Meanwhile, Billy is still lying in hospital with serious wounds all over his face. At the end of the story, Frank is seen taking David back home to live his life back to normal with his children and wife. Meanwhile, Frank joins Curtis, shares stories with other former veterans,